The Salem witch trials were perhaps the most infamous period in American colonial history. Spanning just over a year in the early 1690s, more than 200 people were accused of practicing witchcraft, and almost 20 were executed. The late 17th century was a time of profound change and uncertainty in the American colonies. Frequent wars with indigenous people, disputes with the crown, and religious tensions created a turbulent environment in which beliefs about witches and the devil weren't just superstitions, but they were genuine fears. Long before the Salem witch trials, Europe had been in the grip of witch mania. The 14th to the 17th centuries are often referred to as the Burning Times, and saw thousands of suspected witches executed. From Scandinavia to Spain, tales of black Sabbaths and pacts with the devil fueled an atmosphere of paranoia. However, it wasn't until the 16th and 17th centuries that society saw the true height of the witch craze in Europe. During this era, countless countries across the continent had all witnessed large-scale witch trials, and some regions executed hundreds after extracting confessions through torture. One of the most influential texts of this era was the Malleus Maleficarum. It was written in 1487 by Heinrich Kramer, a German churchman and inquisitor. Kramer was a master of sacred theology, and for many years he was the spiritual director of the great Dominican Church at Salzburg, the order of monks charged with managing the infamous Catholic Inquisition. Heinrich sought out to specifically persecute witches. To him, witchcraft was the closest representation of the devil that existed within the physical world. But unfortunately for Kramer, there wasn't any theoretical grounds to prosecute witches for heresy. It proved almost impossible to get an alleged witch to stand before the Inquisition, so he developed his manual in order to provide detailed guidelines on identifying, questioning, and prosecuting witches. This way, he was able to finally practice what he believed to be divine justice. Heinrich's writings heavily implied that women were more inclined to fall into witchcraft due to a perceived weaker constitution and an inherent susceptibility to temptation. With the book's popularity spanning throughout Europe, it should come as no surprise that when people migrated from the continent to settle in the New World, the fear of witchcraft was already deeply rooted in their lives. And as they migrated across the sea to the colonies, they carried their deep-seated fears and beliefs about witchcraft and the devil. Although heavily influenced by European thought, the American colonies were not as deadly when it came to witch hunts. Before Salem, witchcraft accusations in New England were sporadic. The population witnessed executions few and far between, but however, a volatile mix of growing religious beliefs, societal tensions, and existing superstitions made the colonies, particularly Massachusetts, ripe for an outbreak like Salem. Many of New England's settlers, particularly Puritans, fled Europe seeking religious freedom. However, their interpretation of Christianity was stringent and dogmatic, and while they left Europe to escape religious persecution, they still brought with them the continent's earnest belief in the supernatural. Puritans believed in a strict interpretation of the Bible, predestination, and the inherent sinfulness of humanity. And in Salem, the Puritan church was the cornerstone of the community, serving as both a place of worship and a venue for governance. Regular attendance was mandatory, and the church regulated and monitored the moral life of its congregants. You see, Puritans believed in a very real and active devil. Satan was always attempting to lead the faithful astray, and witchcraft was one of the tools in his arsenal. Witches were supposedly individuals who had entered into a pact with the devil, granting them powers to harm others in exchange for their loyalty. It's also important to keep in mind that while the Salem witch trials were influenced by many factors, the shadow of the ongoing Native American wars of the New World loomed over the proceedings. And Puritan ministers often framed these wars in religious terms, reinforcing the perception of a spiritual battle. Sermons would regularly emphasize the idea that the colonists were God's chosen people and that they faced threats not just from earthly foes, but from demonic forces as well. At the time, fears of Native American attacks were rampant. The recent King William's War had devastated regions of upstate New York, Nova Scotia, and Quebec, resulting in refugees fleeing the frontier settlements and often ending up in places like Salem. You see, these refugees brought with them tales of raids, massacres, and hardships, which only heightened the sense of dread that was already building in the area. In January 1692, two girls by the names of Betty Paris and Abigail Williams began to display bizarre behaviours. This was a significant moment for the citizens of Salem, due to the fact that these girls were the daughter and niece of Reverend Samuel Paris, the village minister. Ministers held significant influence. They were not only spiritual leaders, but also community leaders and educators. And their interpretations of events, especially those they deemed supernatural or sinful, carried significant weight. When Betty and Abigail began to show inexplicable symptoms, including fits, contortions, and outbursts, the community sought explanations. And so Reverend Samuel called upon the local physician, Dr. William Griggs. In the 17th century, medical knowledge was rudimentary compared to today's standards. The understanding of mental and physical health was poor, and so when faced with symptoms or conditions they couldn't explain, physicians and communities often turned to the supernatural for explanation. The concept of bewitchment did not differentiate between physical and mental health issues. Symptoms such as seizures, contortions, and unusual behaviour were all attributed to the influence of witches, blurring the lines between what we would now consider medical, psychological, or psychiatric conditions. When Dr. Griggs examined the girls, he couldn't find any conventional medical explanation, and so in the absence of a clear diagnosis, and given the prevailing beliefs in the supernatural, he turned to the idea that the girls were indeed bewitched. The suggestion of bewitchment by a respectful figure like Dr. Griggs added credibility to the idea that supernatural forces were at play. This, in turn, contributed to the escalation of hysteria within the community, setting the stage for the widespread accusations and trials that followed. The official medical diagnosis of bewitchment gave a religious dimension to the crisis, and the town, now seeking spiritual explanations, turned to Reverend Paris for answers. Pressured to explain their actions, the girls accused 3 women of bewitching them. Tituba, an enslaved woman of South American descent, owned by Reverend Samuel Paris himself. Sarah Good, a destitute woman who lived mainly in a state of social isolation. And Sarah Osborne, a woman whose life was marred by personal conflicts and illness. Out of these 3 women, only one was officially convicted. However, even those who survived the trials, the stigma of being accused of witchcraft lingered with them for the rest of their lives. Life, for someone accused of witchcraft, would have been a harrowing and emotionally destructive experience. The accused faced a hostile environment characterized by fear, suspicion, and a legal system that favored conviction. Once accused, an individual would be arrested and placed in jail where they would suffer greatly. While waiting for a trial, they would spend months living in overcrowded cells and would often experience malnutrition, sickness, and physical abuse from those responsible for guarding them. The interrogations during the Salem witch trials were intense. Admissions of guilt were gained through a combination of physical and psychological pressure. And for many, it felt that confession was their only way to escape further punishment. This tactic created a cycle of accusations throughout Salem, and as individuals under duress provided more and more names, the arrests and trials began to spiral out of control. Gallows Hill was the ultimate consequence for those found guilty, a grim and public spectacle intended as both a punishment and a deterrent to others. As convicted witches, the executed were excommunicated from their churches and as a result never received proper burials. After being hanged, the bodies were simply cut down from the trees and placed in shallow, unmarked graves. The Salem witch trials left a lasting scar on the community and to this day serves as a tragic reminder of the consequences of unchecked fear, and in some cases paying the ultimate price for accusations based on superstition and paranoia.